Ecdc On Air,
the podcast of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control.
Keeping up to date with European epidemiology.
Hello, welcome, and thanks for tuning in to the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control audio series, Ecdc On Air. I'm your host Lee, recording from our headquarters in Stockholm, Sweden. This past year through the pandemic, you might have heard of Ecdc being mentioned here and there, but you may be unfamiliar with what actually goes on here in Stockholm when we're not talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. As an EU agency, Ecdc aims to strengthen Europe's defences against infectious diseases. We cover a wide range of subjects including surveillance, preparedness, epidemic intelligence and response measures. We provide scientific advice, give public health training, and raise awareness through our disease programs. Put simply, we do quite a lot. On today's episode, we're speaking with Dr Agoritsa Baka, Principal Expert for Emergency Preparedness and Response. We discuss what emergency preparedness and response is, looking at the actions that are taken to prevent health threats. While we discuss this in the context of the current pandemic, we also look at how we gain knowledge by learning from previous outbreaks, such as dengue fever, West Nile virus, and even the seasonal flu. We end by looking at how best prepared we can possibly be for any future pandemics. Dr. Agoritsa Baka, thank you for joining me. To begin with, how long have you been here at Ecdc?
I joined Ecdc in March 2018, coming from the National Public Health Institute in Athens, Greece, where I was working since 2002.
Okay, and what brought you here originally?
I'm fascinated by the work at the European level, and I was in contact with the Ecdc before through committees and work with projects and this type of thing. And I really wanted a change from the national level.
You work in public health preparedness. What exactly is that? How would you describe it to a layperson?
That's a very good question. So public health preparedness is all the activities that the government should take in order to prevent a health threat from causing widespread effects in their population. This might be something like a communicable disease, for example, influenza or COVID that we see now, or measles or Ebola. It could be a chemical threat, like, for example, a spill from an industry, something like that. Or it could be any other threat, even a radiological threat, for example.
Okay, but so what does this look like in practice? What is your day-to-day work here at Ecdc?
Our day-to-day work is mostly working with the European countries and trying to help them what we call build capacity, so improve their systems. For example, my section and my team is working a lot with trying to help countries do exercises, to exercise their preparedness plans. We also do a lot of checklists where countries can check if they have all the necessary parts of the plan ready, for example.
Okay, so would you say it's more of a hands-on area in Ecdc's work?
I think it's a combination. I mean, we used to do a lot of country visits before the COVID pandemic. We did a lot of exercises that we kind of organized in one country and other countries would participate. We also did a lot of country visits asking countries to do what we call after-action review. That is a review of an incident or an outbreak, for example, to kind of see what went well, what went wrong. These are examples of hands-on. Other work that we did is a lot of guidance. We produced a lot of guidance, meaning, for example, guidance how to organize an exercise, guidance how to prepare for a high threat, a highly infectious disease, how to measure your preparedness, this type of thing.
Okay. So when you talk about preparedness, what is the time frame that you're talking about? Is there a difference between short-term preparedness, for example, in, say, for a flu season, and long-term preparedness for something that we may not yet see, or are they relatively similar?
I think it's all part of a continuum, actually. It's if you are prepared for a bad flu season, and you are more or less prepared for a pandemic also, or something really acute happening, like a big outbreak, something else affecting your community. So I think it's all part of the same continuum of, let's say, activities that start from how much staff you have and to how many exercises you've done and how well do you know your gaps and how well do you communicate with top of the government.
So things like preparedness not only look at hospitals and health services, but also other levels of society. Is that correct?
This should be actually part of the plan. One of the the issues that we have researched and worked on in my section is the community, what we call community engagement. And as usual, with anything that you need to implement measures, you need to respond, you need to be able to talk and engage your community to follow your guidance. If the community does not follow what you advise, then you're not able to control the outbreak.
Well, I do want to go on to how preparedness is seen by the general public. But before we get onto that, can you give me any real-world examples of how sound preparedness has averted a major threat?
Okay, that's a tough question, and thank you about that. I would have to say that when I thought about this, I think the best example we can have in the recent years is actually how some African countries have responded to the most recent Ebola outbreaks. If you remember, in 2014, we had the huge Ebola outbreak in 3 countries in West Africa. Nevertheless, this past year, we had again Ebola outbreak in one of those 3 in Guinea, and they managed to control it within a few months. And I think this is a very, very good example of how, improved preparedness compared to a few years back made a huge difference. I mean, the last time we had more than 20,000 people lost and a huge, huge outbreak that devastated these 3 poor countries. And now they managed to control it in a few months.
Well, you mentioned Ebola, but before, obviously during the time of COVID now, but before that, what other kinds of outbreaks was ECDC monitoring and focusing on?
As we are monitoring all types of communicable diseases that are under surveillance officially according to EU legislation, but also any other communicable disease that could pose a problem from, for example, introduction through travelers or something like that in Europe. So classic examples of what we follow are dengue outbreaks, other what we call vector-borne disease outbreaks, meaning transmitted from mosquitoes or ticks or other animals. We also follow the yearly flu outbreaks. We follow the West Nile outbreaks in the summer, cholera outbreaks. Different. I'm forgetting a lot, but different outbreaks. Yeah, all over the world.
Okay, so you mentioned the community itself and the general public. Would you say that preparedness and response has been overlooked in public life in terms of public health?
I think definitely. I mean, we saw at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we saw how understaffed, underfinanced had public health been all over Europe and all over the world. We've seen that consistently in the last years. I mean, it's difficult to sell to the government prevention activities that do not show real benefit and really fast. Although actually one of the best, let's say, investment a government can make is in prevention projects. But still having, for example, public health staff that is trained frequently and having exercises which are really expensive governments do not really like to spend time and money on these type of things, which do not show very, huge benefit immediately. However, we saw at the beginning of COVID how we were missing trained staff that could do contact tracing, tools to do contact tracing, how we missed good laboratories and public health laboratories that could do all the assessments and the quality assurance for testing. A lot of things that could have been better.
All right, so we've left it long enough. Now we kind of have to talk about the COVID pandemic. What have we learned from the pandemic in terms of preparedness and response?
Okay, we are still in the pandemic, so we still haven't finalized the lessons. I think the first one should be that we need to keep a minimum of capacity in public health all over Europe, and we need to take it much more seriously. That's one. We need a lot more tools to be adopted and ready to be run immediately at short notice, let's say. The good thing is that we now have a lot of new tools that could be assessed and used, meaning for contact tracing, for communicating with the public, different things. As far as EU is concerned, we really need to do a lot better in coordination. I don't know how we could do that, but I think this is something that we need to seriously discuss with the member states. And I think the countries will have a lot of after-action reviews to do at many levels, and it could be very different regionally also, because they had very different needs in different regions.
Would you say we are better prepared for the next pandemic?
That's a big question. I don't know. I think people are very scared, and I think the politicians are really scared of what happened, and a lot of the sectors were really, they are on their knees now. So they are really scared of this, and they don't want it to happen again. This was like the worst crisis they went through after 1970 and the oil crisis in 1970, and it didn't even come close. I mean, as far as their losses. So I think it's going to be a lot of pressure so that we avoid something this big in the future. I am a little bit skeptical in the fact that there will be a lot of pressure, let's say, to avoid, for example, extreme measures and this type of thing, and or a lot more modeling, which we know is still not at the level that will give us a lot of actionable results.
Well, do you think that there could be some positive outcomes of the pandemic in terms of preparedness, that people are less reluctant to, say, go into a short-term lockdown, less reluctant to wear masks? Things like hand hygiene and respiratory hygiene are now thought of more because of COVID than they were previously, and how that could affect things like flu season or anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. I would definitely think that at least, with the cost we paid for this pandemic, that definitely some of those simpler measures are going to stay for us for a long time. I mean, even from the 1918 pandemic of influenza, I think they say that's when respiratory hygiene started, is when people, when the messages were do not spit out and use a handkerchief or something. And at least now we will start, it will stay more. I think definitely for the flu seasons that you should wear a mask. I think wearing a mask will be much more easier, even in the Western society, let's say, because in Asia it was much more common. Hand hygiene, respiratory hygiene, ventilation, limiting visitors in hospitals and this type of thing. Yeah, definitely, I think a lot of lessons, we will get a lot of lessons from for vaccination, from behavior scientists, regarding all the measures and stuff. I hope that we'll be able to use them.
Has preparedness for other infections and diseases taken a back seat because of COVID. You mentioned briefly Ebola this year. I think a lot of people may not even known that there was another outbreak. But in terms of, say, sexually transmitted diseases, the flu season obviously has been very low compared to previous years. But are we maybe missing taking so much interest in other things that are happening?
Yeah, probably. And there are people who have been concerned, for example, that childhood vaccinations are falling back. People did not go to their doctors and their doctor's appointments because they had to stay home or they were concerned and they didn't want to go to a healthcare facility. And definitely we saw a large decrease of the reported cases of other diseases to ECDC. And we know probably it's not that they stopped existing because of COVID. It's just that, all the public health institutes were overwhelmed and they didn't have time to look for the other stuff.
Well, given that the future is always uncertain and it's never quite possible to predict what exactly will happen, how prepared is it possible to actually be?
That's a good question. I don't know how prepared. I would say you cannot be 100% prepared because you cannot really guess what is coming. We kept saying that we will have another influenza pandemic and we got another respiratory virus. But the next virus could be something else. I mean, that's what everybody keeps saying, that with the climate change and the difference of human nature interface from now on, other viruses, probably another virus could jump to humans and cause another health threat or another disease. We don't know. I think you can be maybe, up to 50%, something like that.
Okay. Well, looking at the pandemic as a whole, what would you say has been the toughest moment or the hardest thing that you've had to deal with?
I think it was very hard when I started seeing that my country had started having a difficult time and I was away and I was doing another job which was really interesting and really worthwhile, but I was not there to help. I suppose part of the hard, let's say, experience was that I was away from family and, people, close contact, and they were in a different country having a completely different experience of the pandemic.
I can imagine that must be quite difficult. My final question today, did you ever think that there would be a threat of this magnitude hitting us in the 21st century?
As I said, everybody was saying that we will have a new influenza pandemic. It was already 10 years from the last one in 2009. So we started saying, okay, we might see a new influenza pandemic. And always there was this, the threat and the history of 1918 and how hard that pandemic was, how many lives were lost. I really did not expect that this would happen with us. It's a little bit perversion professionnelle for us, but it's a lifetime experience. And for us, it's extremely interesting. But we've seen, even just reading about it, it's the cost in lives and sorrow is amazing all over the world, and it hasn't stopped. And we are seeing now that it's hitting Africa, and we don't know where it's going to stop. So it's a big issue, and it teaches us a lot about ourselves, about how much we love one another. Actually, we don't, I think. We are very selfish, and this shows from the personal level up to the country level. And we see how countries are like me, only me. I don't know about the rest of you.
Well, I think that's something that preparedness will obviously have to take into account more in the future. But we shall leave it there for today. Dr. Baka, thank you very much for your time today. We hope you enjoyed this insight into ECDC's emergency preparedness and response work. If you would like to know more, please visit us on the web at ecdc.europa.eu or follow us on social media for the latest news.